It was just past noon on January 15, 1919, and the streets of Boston's North End were alive with the usual hum of activity. Horses clopped along the cobblestones, children laughed as they darted between carts, and dock workers wiped the sweat from their brows despite the winter chill. It was colder than usual that day, around 40 F, but the sky was clear, the sun was out, and for most Bostonians, it was just another ordinary Wednesday. But something wasn't right on Commercial Street. In the shadow of the elevated railway, near Keeney Square, a massive steel tank 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide towered over the neighborhood. It belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company and contained over 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses. Sticky, dark, and sweet, the molasses had been shipped in from the Caribbean, destined for fermentation into ethanol. Ethanol that would be used in everything from industrial solvents to munitions and, unofficially, as the key ingredient in bootleg booze. The tank had always looked wrong. Locals said it grown at night, expanding and contracting with the weather. It leaked so frequently that children would collect the dripping syrup in jars, treating it like free candy. Horses avoided walking near it, and neighbors had reported metallic creaks, rivets popping, and strange vibrations in the air. But no one did anything. You see, this was 1919. The First World War had just ended. Industry was booming. Regulations were more suggestion than rule. If a corporation said the tank was safe, well, it must be safe. After all, what harm can molasses possibly do? At around 12:40 p.m., that illusion shattered. Without warning, a deep, metallic groan echoed across the neighborhood. Some described it like a machine being torn apart. Others thought it was an explosion. But what followed was something no one in Boston had ever seen or could ever forget. The steel tank burst open with a thunderous roar. In an instant, more than 2 million gallons of thick, pressurized molasses surged into the streets. A 25-foot-high wave of syrup shot out with astonishing force, reaching speeds of over 35 miles per hour. It moved faster than anyone could run, stronger than any human could resist. The wave smashed through wooden buildings, lifted entire train cars off their tracks, and swept horses into the harbor. The force tore off doors, shattered windows, and crumpled structures like paper. The elevated railway trembled as girders buckled. People were knocked off their feet and pinned against walls. Some were pulled under, drowning not in water but in sticky, suffocating syrup. Witnesses described the noise as a mix between rushing water and screaming metal. They saw people struggling to stand, only to be sucked back down. One firehouse was lifted from its foundation. Firemen inside had no time to react. The molasses poured in through windows and doors like a living thing, filling every space it touched. And then silence. When the wave finally stopped, the damage was staggering. A section of Boston's waterfront looked as though a bomb had gone off, but instead of smoke and fire, everything was coated in a thick layer of dark brown sludge. Bodies were trapped beneath debris. Hearses lay motionless, their legs twisted. Survivors were coughing, gasping, and covered head to toe in syrup. Rescue crews arrived quickly, but their efforts were hindered by the sheer viscosity of the molasses. Walking through it was like trying to wade through wet concrete. Tools stuck, boots were pulled off. Victims screamed, but were impossible to locate beneath the goo. And as night fell, the cold turned the syrup even thicker, freezing it onto surfaces and into clothing. The city was in shock. In total, 21 people were killed. Over 150 were injured. Entire families were displaced. Businesses destroyed. And yet, for days after, the cleanup effort was almost as horrifying as the flood itself. Molasses had seeped into the cracks of sidewalks, into basements, into sewers. It stuck to skin and hair. It was tracked on shoes into homes and across the city. Firemen hosed streets with salt water. Sand was dumped by the ton to soak up the syrup, but nothing seemed to work fast enough. There were reports that Boston Harbor remained brown for months. People claimed their clothes never came clean, that every time it rained, you could smell sugar. That even years later, on hot summer days, the scent of molasses still lingered in the North End, and while the physical cleanup would eventually end, the deeper questions were just beginning, because how did this happen? How did a neighborhood in one of America's oldest cities get drowned, literally drowned in syrup? Who built that tank? Who ignored the warnings? And was this truly just an accident, or something much more sinister? They say history repeats itself, but what about the parts we forgot? Welcome to Echoes of History, the channel where we dig up the dusty corners of the past to uncover the weird, the wild, and the wait, what? Stories they didn't teach you in school. Grab your curiosity, and maybe a cup of tea, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. To understand how molasses became a threat to an entire city, you have to go back not just to the days before the flood, but decades earlier. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, molasses wasn't just a sweetener. It was a commodity, a symbol of industrial power, and in New England, it was big business. Molasses was imported by the ton from the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the West End is where sugarcane plantations were still running at full force. Once shipped to the U.S. this thick, Sticky syrup was offloaded into enormous tanks in port cities like Boston, but it wasn't for pancakes or candy. No, this molasses had a higher calling. It was destined to become alcohol, not the drinking kind. Necessarily, though, that certainly happened too, but ethanol, a base ingredient in the production of munitions, explosives, fuel, and especially rum. During World War I, demand for ethanol skyrocketed. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, one of the biggest molasses importers in the country, made its fortune converting molasses into wartime supplies. Boston's North End, with its bustling docks and immigrant labor force, was the perfect location for their operation. It was close to the water, close to the rail lines, and cheap enough to build fast, without much oversight. That's how the giant molasses tank came to be rushed into existence in 1915, just 4 years before the disaster. The tank itself was massive, over 50 feet tall, nearly 100 feet across, and able to hold more than 2.3 million gallons. But from the very beginning, it was a disaster waiting to happen. It was poorly designed, badly built, and never properly tested. The steel was too thin. The rivets were too weak. The welds were incomplete. It leaked from day one, but the company didn't care. When residents complained, they painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Workers weren't surprised when they heard groaning from inside. The tank would expand during warm weather, contract during the cold, and groan like a living thing. No one investigated. No inspectors were called, and no government agency stepped in, because in those days, corporations policed themselves, and profits mattered more than people. And here's where timing made everything worse. In 1919, Prohibition was looming. The 18th Amendment banning the sale and manufacture of alcohol had just been ratified. It would take effect in exactly 1 year. That meant the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company had a small window to push as much molasses through their system as possible. In the weeks before the flood, the company began rushing shipments. They overfilled the tank. They didn't let it settle. They dumped warm molasses on top of cold molasses, creating a pressure cooker effect inside the steel walls. And it wasn't just about profit. Molasses had become a political tool. Anti-immigrant sentiment was rising in Boston. Many in the North End were Italian or Irish immigrants seen by wealthy elites as unruly, unclean, and indisposable. When the tank started leaking, when the groaning got louder, when the air smelled like syrup and iron, no one listened. Not the company, not the city, not the press. It's possible that if this tank had been located in a wealthier neighborhood, the story would have ended differently. But in the North End, where factories hummed and tenements crumbled, no one seemed to mind the danger until it was too late. Molasses wasn't just sticky, it was symbolic. This was a time when industry was king, when unchecked capitalism built cities faster than people could live in them, when materials were pushed to their limits, when safety regulations were seen as unnecessary red tape. The molasses tank was a monument to that mindset. Build it big, build it fast, and don't ask too many questions. On January 15, 1919, those questions came crashing down along with 2.3 million gallons of syrup. What followed was not just a flood, it was the result of years of neglect, greed, and misplaced priorities. The sweet smell of molasses may have filled the air, but the aftermath would leave a bitter taste for decades. January 15, 1919 began like any other day in Boston's North End. Schoolchildren filed into classrooms. Dock workers unloaded freight. Housewives shopped for bread and fish. The wind carried the smell of the harbor, mixed with the ever-present scent of molasses that clung to the neighborhood like fog. No one expected that by the afternoon, the streets would resemble something closer to a battlefield than a neighborhood. It happened just after 12:40 p.m. Witnesses reported hearing a low, thunderous rumble like a train derailing or a building collapsing. It came from 529 Commercial Street, where the enormous molasses tank stood brooding above the city. Some said it sounded like gunfire. Others described it as a roar, as if the tank had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. Then came the explosion. The tank ruptured with an ear-splitting crack. Steel plates, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were ripped from their rivets and hurled into the air like frisbees. A shockwave burst outward, breaking windows blocks away, and then, almost impossibly, a wave of molasses erupted into the streets, thick, dark, and moving far faster than anyone believed possible. The wall of syrup stood over 25 feet tall. It raced through the city at more than 35 miles per hour, smashing everything in its path. Wooden buildings were crushed. Sidewalks were ripped up. A freight car was picked up and thrown across the rail yard like a toy. People who saw it coming had no time to react. It wasn't just water, it was a churning tide of sugar and pressure, dense enough to flatten walls and drown a grown man in seconds. The force of the molasses knocked over the support beams of the elevated railway. One train narrowly avoided derailing when its operator slammed the brakes. Watching helplessly as the street below became a river of death, horses were swept from their hooves and buried alive. Some people were found later with bones broken, lungs filled, and bodies coated in a hardened glaze. One man, Antonio Di Stasio, was walking with his sisters when the wave hit. He was thrown against a lamppost and knocked unconscious. His sisters were dragged nearly 100 feet and trapped under collapsed debris. Miraculously, they survived, but the psychological trauma lasted a lifetime. At the firehouse of Engine 31, the building was torn from its foundation. Firemen inside were crushed by collapsing walls or pinned under furniture. Rescuers arrived quickly but couldn't reach them. The syrup was too thick. Ropes snapped, boots stuck. Every step was a fight against a substance that clung to everything, pulling people down like quicksand. Molasses is 6 times more dense than water. Imagine being hit by a wave of it, hot from fermentation, sticky as glue, and completely unforgiving. People didn't just drown, they suffocated. Their clothes were soaked instantly. Their limbs slowed. Every movement made them sink deeper. Screams were muffled, and as the flood cooled, the syrup hardened, turning into a trap from which few could escape. Rescue workers used axes, shovels, and bare hands. They dug for hours, only to find bodies locked in twisted poses, their last movements frozen in syrup. Some were never identified. Others were disfigured beyond recognition. And yet, amidst the horror, there were moments of heroism. Bystanders dove into the muck to save strangers. A group of sailors from the USS Nantucket rushed ashore, pulling people out with ropes and boards. Police officers formed chains to wade through the molasses, passing victims from hand to hand. Firemen, injured themselves, refused to leave their posts. Doctors and nurses turned nearby homes into makeshift clinics. By nightfall, the city was unrecognizable. The streets of the North End were silent, except for the sounds of sloshing boots and quiet weeping. Lights flickered in windows as families searched for missing loved ones. The air was thick not just with molasses, but with confusion, grief, and disbelief. Everyone had the same question on their lips. How could this happen? The newspapers wasted no time. Headlines called it Boston's sticky tragedy. Reporters marveled at the surreal details, the color, the texture, the smell, but beneath the novelty was genuine shock. This wasn't just an accident. This was a collapse of trust, a betrayal of safety, and a sign that the city, for all its progress and pride, had failed its people. The next morning, the real work began. Bodies had to be recovered, streets had to be cleared, infrastructure had to be inspected. But the most important cleanup, the one that would take years, was invisible. It involved lawyers, judges, engineers, and the slow, grinding process of justice. But before we get there, let's go back to that tank, because while the syrup drowned the streets, the real flood had started long before. It began with negligence, with greed, with the assumption that no one would notice until they had no choice. When the wave of molasses finally stopped moving, it didn't just leave behind broken buildings and crushed bodies, it left behind a nightmare that clung to every surface. Boston had seen fires, floods, and snowstorms, but nothing like this, because how do you clean up a city smothered in sugar? First came the sound silence, broken only by boots suctioning against syrup-covered ground, and the low murmurs of survivors trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then the smell, overpoweringly sweet, fermented, cloying, and sickening. For many, it would be months before they could stand the scent of sugar again. Firefighters, police, and volunteers poured into the North End within hours, but they quickly discovered that traditional rescue methods didn't work. Ropes were useless, molasses snapped them. Stretchers stuck in place, horses that survived the flood couldn't move, vehicles stalled out or slid uselessly in the syrup. The city had become sticky, a mobile swamp. Men tried shoveling the syrup, but each scoop was a battle. It clung to metal, stuck to gloves, and refused to let go. Some used sawdust, hoping to soak it up. Others dumped sand by the truckload. The city diverted salt water from the harbor in an attempt to dilute the mess. Hoses blasted water at buildings and cobblestone, but all it did was spread the molasses further. Soon, it wasn't just the North End affected. Cleanup crews tracking syrup on their boots left trails throughout downtown. Offices, trolleys, and even courtrooms began to smell faintly sweet. People found molasses on doorknobs and railings. One man claimed his dog's fur stayed sticky for weeks. No matter how often he bathed it, the Boston Post joked that everything a Bostonian touched was sticky. Worse still, winter had returned with a vengeance. The temperature dropped below freezing just days after the flood. The molasses began to solidify. It froze into patches of black ice that cracked underfoot, but still wouldn't come off. What had once flowed like lava now set like resin. Axes and picks replaced shovels. The city looked as though it had been caught in a candy-coated apocalypse. The human toll deepened with each passing day. Rescue workers uncovered more bodies, some fully encased in syrup, others wedged beneath beams or pinned under carts. Many had suffocated, their lungs filled with molasses. Others were crushed or drowned. Of the 21 confirmed dead, most were workers or residents from the neighborhood, but their names, faces, and stories rarely made the front page. Instead, newspapers focused on the spectacle. Photos of firemen wading through syrup, sketches of molasses waves taller than houses, sensational headlines, sweet death in Boston, flood of syrup claims 21 for days. The press couldn't decide whether to treat the disaster as tragedy or comedy, and that ambiguity between horror and absurdity defined how the public responded. Some joked that the streets had never been so tasty. Others made light of Boston's new pancake problem, but beneath the laughter was a city in crisis, a neighborhood gutted, and families grieving losses no amount of sugar could soften. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company responded, but not with apologies. Instead, they deflected blame. They claimed the tank had been sabotaged possibly by anarchists or enemies of capitalism. After all, the Red Scare was in full swing. Anti-immigrant hysteria ran high. The idea of foreign agitators blowing up the tank fit the narrative, and for a time, it diverted attention from the company's negligence, but the people of Boston weren't buying it. Witnesses came forward, workers, neighbors, even children who had long complained about the tank's leaks, its groans, its rusting seams. Several engineers warned that the structure had never been properly tested. One investigator found that the steel used to build the tank was brittle and thinner than industry standards. The rivets were flawed. The seams were faulty. The entire thing had been built on a rush order with little to no oversight. In other words, the tank had been a ticking time bomb. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't bad luck. It was bad management. Still, justice moved slowly. The cleanup would last for months. The lawsuits would drag on for years. And the people most affected, poor immigrant families, were often left to fend for themselves. Few had insurance. Fewer still had lawyers. The molasses may have been washed from the streets, but it stuck to memory, to policy, to the very soul of the North End. By the summer of 1919, the smell had finally started to fade. But for some, it never left. Residents said that on hot days, the syrup would rise from the cracks again. That when the wind blew just right, they could still taste it in the air. For decades, old-timers would point to the corner of Commercial Street and mutter, "That's where the tank stood," as if it had been a monster or a ghost. In truth, it was worse. It had been a monument to neglect, a structure born of greed and arrogance, and though it was gone, its shadow lingered long after the last drop of syrup had been scrubbed from the bricks. The cleanup may have ended in the streets, in the courtrooms of Boston. The real battle was just beginning. What happened on January 15th? 1919 was more than a tragic accident, it was a test. A test of accountability, of justice, of whether ordinary people could hold the powerful. Corporation responsible for the destruction of their lives, the city needed answers. Within weeks of the disaster, more than 100 lawsuits had been filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The plaintiffs included grieving families, injured survivors, property owners, and the city of Boston itself. The question at the center of all these cases was simple: who was to blame for the molasses flood? The company, for its part, denied everything. From the very beginning, they pushed a narrative of sabotage. Their lawyers claimed that Italian anarchists had placed a bomb inside the tank, revenge, perhaps, for U.S. intervention abroad, or for the company's anti-labor policies. It was 1919. After all, the Red Scare was in full swing. Fear of radicals and foreign agitators ran deep in the American psyche, but there was no evidence. No bomb fragments, no warning letters, no witnesses, just speculation and fear. Still, the strategy was clever. By invoking sabotage, USI attempted to frame themselves not as villains, but victims. Victims of political violence, victims of extremism, and more importantly, they hoped to shift attention away from the tank's design, construction, and oversight. But the plaintiffs had something more powerful than spin. They had facts. Witness after witness took the stand, each painting a picture of a tank that had been defective from the start. One employee testified that the tank had leaked so badly, he'd painted it brown just to hide the syrup stains. Another recalled how the structure groaned and bulged during hot weather. Local residents, many of them poor immigrants, spoke of children collecting molasses from the sidewalk, of horses spooked by the noise, of rivets popping out like corks from a bottle. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from an engineer, who revealed that the tank had never been pressure tested before it was filled, not once. No city inspector had ever signed off on the structure. In fact, the company had never even submitted detailed blueprints. The courtroom gasped. This wasn't just negligence, it was indifference. The trial was overseen by an auditor named Hugh Ogden, who listened to more than 3,000 pages of testimony over the course of 5 years. It was the longest civil case in Massachusetts history. At the time, dozens of experts were called: engineers, chemists, metallurgists. Lawyers argued over steel brittleness, thermal expansion, fluid dynamics, and corporate responsibility. But beneath the technical jargon, the case was really about something much simpler: trust. Could a company be trusted to police itself? Could a tank be built without oversight and still be safe? Could an immigrant community expect the same protection as wealthier neighborhoods? The USIAS defense crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance as the trial wore on. It became clear that the molasses tank had been rushed into service during wartime, without proper testing, that its materials were substandard, and that complaints had been ignored for years. In 1925-6, years after the flood auditor Ogden issued his final decision, he found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company responsible. The ruling stated clearly that the tank had not been sabotaged. It had failed because of structural weakness, poor construction, and a complete disregard for public safety. The company was ordered to pay more than $600,000 in damages, roughly $10 million today. Families of the victims received compensation, businesses received settlements, and Boston's legal system took a collective breath. It was a landmark decision, not just because of the payout, but because it signaled a turning point in corporate accountability. For the first time in American history, a major company had been held financially liable for a disaster caused by faulty infrastructure. The verdict sent shockwaves through industry. Engineers were called to tighten safety standards. City officials began requiring permits and inspections. The age of unregulated industrial growth had met its reckoning in a flood of molasses. But the ruling didn't erase the pain. For families who lost loved ones, the money was cold comfort. For the injured, no settlement could undo the trauma. And for the residents of the North End, the stain of being ignored, dismissed, and endangered lingered long after the courtroom emptied. Still, the trial had done something powerful. It had told the truth. It had pulled back the curtain on how greed and negligence can kill. It had validated the voices of people who were often invisible to power. And it had set a precedent that would echo through future disasters: mining collapses, dam failures, and oil spills. The molasses flood wasn't just about syrup. It was about what happens when we value profit over people, about what happens when warning signs are ignored, and about what happens when we finally say, enough. Long after the syrup was washed away and the courtrooms had fallen silent, the Great Molasses Flood remained etched in the soul of Boston, not as a freak accident, but as a symbol of industrial recklessness, a failure of oversight, a moment when a neighborhood paid the price for a company's negligence, and, oddly enough, a moment that the city could never fully forget. For years, people swore they could still smell it on hot summer days, especially in the North End. Old-timers would claim the scent of molasses returned, seeping from the cracks between bricks, rising from sun-baked cobblestones, whispering through the alleyways like a ghost. Whether it was real or just collective memory, playing tricks, it didn't matter. The story had settled into legend. But this wasn't the kind of legend that fades into myth. It remained tangible. The intersection of Commercial Street and Copp's Hill Terrace, once sticky and sunken, was rebuilt, but the site of the tank never quite disappeared from public consciousness. For decades, Bostonians passed it on their daily walks, some not realizing the tragedy that had unfolded there. Others couldn't forget. It became a quiet marker of loss and accountability. In time, the story spread beyond Boston. Writers, journalists, and historians found the flood too bizarre to ignore. It became a favorite in the list of strange disasters and weird history. It appeared in trivia games, school lessons, and even comedy sketches. People laughed at the absurdity of it, a tidal wave of molasses, and in doing so, they often missed the gravity beneath the sugar. Because the flood was never just about molasses. It was about what happens when warnings are ignored, when systems are rushed, when responsibility is delayed until it's too late. The people of the North End didn't die because of an act of nature. They died because of choices made in boardrooms, on construction sites, and city halls, where no one thought the complaints of working-class immigrants really mattered. That's why the legacy matters, not because it's quirky, but because it's cautionary. And yet, the story also holds a strange kind of hope, because the flood led to real change. After the disaster and the landmark court ruling, cities across America began rethinking their approach to safety regulations. Engineers tightened their standards. Municipalities demanded building permits, inspections, oversight. The days of trusting industrial giants to self-regulate were numbered, in a way. The molasses flood helped modernize urban policy. It forced a conversation about who gets protected and who gets ignored. And it reminded people then and now that sometimes the strangest stories carry the deepest truths. Today, there's a small plaque near the site of the disaster, simple and unassuming. It reads, on January 15, 1919, a molasses tank burst, and a wave of molasses rushed through the streets of Boston, killing 21 people. It's easy to walk past it without a second thought, but if you stop, if you take a moment to look around the old buildings, the narrow lanes, the harbor breeze, you might just feel the weight of it. Not the syrup, the history, the lives interrupted, the justice hard-won, the lessons still relevant. And if you listen closely, you might even hear the echoes of groaning steel, of panicked footsteps, of a city forced to reckon with the sticky consequences of its own hubris. Because some disasters don't just pass through time, they linger, they stain, and they remind us. Never again. That's it for today's Forgotten Tale. If this story made you raise an eyebrow, or don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that dusty little bell so you never miss another echo from the past. Drop it in the comments. We're always listening for new echoes. Got a weird bit of history you think we should cover? Until next time, keep your curiosity loud and your history weird. That's it for today's Forgotten Tale. If this story made you